For any of you who may not be as familiar with Ed as a lot of us are, let me just say that we have the privilege tonight of really sitting down with one of Los Angeles's major artists, cultural treasures. Ed is now entering his 6th decade as an artist in Los Angeles and is one of the most critically acclaimed, actively exhibited artists working in Los Angeles today. Over the last year and a half with Pacific Standard Time, there were 60 museum exhibitions around Southern California talking about the emergence of the LA art scene, and it seemed that Ed Moses was in every other one of them. From temporary storefronts downtown where you had this amazing show with your pals Bob Irwin and Bob Wilhite and Laddie John Dill and Larry Bell, to important inclusion in the Getty's exhibition and at MoCA and other significant galleries. We even had a really fun show at my gallery called Ed's Party, which kind of gave a cross-generational view of the art scene in LA, and Ed had an amazing piece in it. So tonight we're looking forward to talking a little bit about Ed's process, his work, but also with all of the interest now that seems to be happening in Los Angeles, there is a tremendous focus on the history of LA. How did this happen? How did the scene emerge? And so we'll be talking about that. But first I want to say, how many of you in the audience own an Ed Moses? All right, look at that. That's a very good support group. How many of you are younger than 15? Could I ask Django to stand up, please? This is Ed's newest and youngest collector. Ed has a very sweet show that's up right now at Joe's Restaurant in Venice. And I went to the opening last week. It was on Ed's birthday. By the way, happy birthday, Ed. And there was a piece I kind of had my eye on, but I was told it was already sold. And so I think that, and where do you go to school, Django? Here. Okay, need I say more? This is the school of the future. Art dealers are going to take note. We're going to be hanging around. We'll be talking to you. So congratulations. I think it's just terrific, and it speaks volumes about the level of awareness and sophistication of what a good school can do, to have someone that is that present and that prescient. God, if I had started collecting when I was 11. Ed, what you could have had, we could have collected.
Mm-hmm.
So,
what do you think of the idea of turning the lights off and just leaving the screen light on?
We could. It's up to...
Then we could see the people in the audience. Or turn them down. Is there any way to ratchet them down? Oh.
That's good.
That's getting better now, just that one and that one up there. Okay. Do we look pink? That's appropriate. I like pink.
Well,
that's great.
That's good.
Better. Now we can see you.
I also want to say before we get started, Ed has some work currently at Ernie Wolf's gallery, Turkana, with a really fun show called Local Fish. I was over there before the show opened, and you had some really great new pieces in the show. Proceeds go to Heal the Bay. So
Heal the Bay, right?
Yeah, it's a great cause.
I didn't know that, but I'm glad to hear it.
So Ed, let me just start first by saying, with all of the attention now through Pacific Standard Time, through the Pompidou's exhibition of LA artists several years ago in Paris, does it finally feel like LA is coming into its own and the artists from LA are getting their due?
There's more activity going on now. And maybe they're getting more attention. And the attention is more applicable to being a professional artist. Both things that bother me, not that I don't participate in it, but it does bother me because it gets in the way. And we'll continue on. you have
Perfect.
more
Well,
questions.
why don't we start with, did you make art as a kid growing up?
Yes, my first work was in my bassinet. And my mother heard these sounds, and my aunt, they were inseparable. She was a fabulous person. And she's the one that showed me the other side of the mirror, so to speak. And she had a great sense of humor and very eccentric. Anyway, they heard me being very happy in this other room, so they went into the other room, and there I was drawing on the wall with baby shit, making these big looping marks. My aunt told me, and she said, that kid's going to be an artist. And my mother was less than amused by that situation, but anyway, actually, in school, I could draw airplanes and profile and helmets and Trojan warriors and things, but always in two-dimensional, always flat. Mm-hmm. I never had the ability to make it a volume on a flat surface or a flat plane. And, but I really had very minor interest in ever being an artist. It was a kind of romantic concept. So when I was young, I used to watch or see Fred Astaire movies. So when my mother went out, I would dance all over the place, turning furniture over and doing those Gene Kelly things and all those moves. But I could never tell any of my comrades because being a dancer was less than what you would be if you're a guy. And
when did it really click for you that being an artist might be the path?
Well, I took mechanical drawing, and I loved mechanical drawing. And I loved to make the fine lines and the dimensions and all of the things like that. But during World War II, when I was in the Navy, I had a kind of review of looking at myself as somebody that could do something. In school, I was mostly a failure. I ditched. I never liked it. I couldn't memorize. I had no skills for learning, let's put it that way. And I remember I couldn't read until I was 14. They put me in a remedial reading class. And when I was in the Navy, they used to give you these magazines, Saturday Evening Post, and I started reading these stories and the romantic stories. But then came this guy, Philip Wiley, who was a pseudo-intellectual, but I'd never come across a pseudo-intellectual. And then I was introduced to Jack London, and that turned the whole thing around with reading, with the possibilities, with the thinking, what the mind was capable of carrying out. Mm-hmm. And so I got out of I wanted to be a surgeon. I was in pre-med for 3 years and just making a mess out of it because I didn't like to study and I couldn't memorize. So I had terrible grades, and the only medical school that was accepting people of my caliber was Mexico City. They would accept the less than brilliant students because the brilliant students went to Stanford and SC and places like that. And my father had set a little sum of money aside so that I could, and he was very disappointed. A friend of mine took art classes from this very eccentric guy. Well, I walked over to see this guy. He drove in, and the parking lot was full of telephone poles lying horizontally along where your car would come in and be interrupted and make you stop. And he came racing in this old Willys. I don't know if you know it. Willys made the first Jeeps. It was Willys Knights was the company. And it was a convertible, or was a convertible. And he had a 1x2 across the windshield with a couple of seat clamps on it and canvas tacked down. Staple guns weren't there at that time. Staple guns was something that artists discovered later to stretch their canvas over a frame. And so he had tacked these things, and in the back there was naturally a piece of wood that ran around the back. And he had canvas, and when he drove in, it was flapping up and down. He hit the telephone pole, both doors popped open, and he stepped out like a prince. I mean, he had attitude, and I'd never seen one of these guys before. Being raised in Long Beach, the home of the Iowa picnic, every year they would have a big picnic in Bixby Park, and people from all over came there, and everyone was straight and ordinary and conservative. So here was this guy. Where did this guy come from? Well, he lived in Palos Verdes Hills. He had 4 sons, and one of them was Plopsy, and the other one was Plopsy, and they had these strange names. And he had wild, curly brown hair with clay in it and paint on his hands, and he had a tweed jacket. The pockets were torn out, but he had attitude. He walked right into that door like he was, and we followed in. And I said, wow, look at this guy, huh? And they said, I told you this guy was something, because they'd never seen anybody like that in Long Beach either. So he immediately turned the waste paper basket upside down and started lecturing. And he told us about Picasso and Braque and Cézanne and all these people none of us had ever heard of. And he said, one thing, I hate Norman Rockwell. Norman Rockwell is sort of a character now of some success. And he did the illustrations on Saturday Evening Post, sort of folksy, homey illustrations of families.
My parents, by the way, loved Norman Rockwell, and
Yeah,
every
right.
Christmas I would get a Norman Rockwell book, highly regarded at that time.
Well, right now, I think they're quite valuable. Didn't your friend... Anyway, so he lectured, and then the next day he gave us a list of all the art material. Well, I was on the GI Bill, and I came in with this armload of great brushes and all these paraphernalia, and he sat us down on this stool. It was like this, and you straddled it, and there was a little groove, and then you had your drawing board leaning, the stool went like this, there, and then a clip. You had clips that held heavy paper or lightweight canvas sheets. So he set up a still life. And he said, now remember, I don't want to see any fussy drawing and Norman Rockwellism in this class. I'd already introduced you to Picasso, Braque, Cézanne, etc., all those masters of that period. That was pre-Pollock and abstract expressionist by several years. And so everybody, he said, there it is, you're off, go. And people are holding up pencils and measuring, and I was looking at that, and I said, holy, what have I gotten myself in? I have no skills at learning to draw or anything like that, although I could make edges, flat planes and automobiles. Everybody did them on their notebooks. So he's moving from one student to another and really giving them a bad time, ridiculing and laughing at this horrible work they were doing, and they thought they were doing great. And he kept getting closer and closer and closer to me. And as he was about there, I said, oh God, I'd better get out of here now. I stayed. And as he approached me, we had these tempera paints along a little frame, and he showed us earlier how to mix the right amount of water in the tempera so when you put the brush down it would flow. It wouldn't static or be a dry brush. That was all the instructions he gave us. So as he was near where Bill is sitting now, I stuck my fingers in the wells and I just did this thing as a kind of confrontation, I think, not as something that was a brilliant idea or an expressive idea, an attitude of being an artist. It was just defiant. It was a kind of defiant move. And he got over there and he looked down at that, and he looked at me, looked down again, and around the perimeter of the room was a 4-inch shelf where he could put these illustrations of Braque, Picasso, etc., on a little ridge that went around the room. And he took mine, it was mounted on this with these clips, I think it was heavy paper, I can't remember, and put it on this ridge. And he said, "Now here's a real artist." And the guy wrecked my life. Or now, of course, I really like my life. I like what I do, and I look forward every morning to painting.
So that's really set you on a...
I was taking some theater arts courses too, and I was in a one-act play, and the faculty from the art department all came over to watch and laugh at me being goofy.
We have a few early drawings you did when you were around 25. How much after when you started, from that class and you started getting into this?
Well, this was 48 that I started with Miller's class, and this is 50 when I transferred to UCLA, and I hated UCLA. It wasn't what my expectations were. And
who was teaching there then? Was Henry there?
No, Henry wasn't there. Bill Bryce, who was really the dream of a guy and a teacher, who was Fanny Bryce's son, and a brilliant draftsman and a wonderful guy. And Gordon Nunes, who was not such a wonderful guy, and Jan Stussy, I can't remember, Brown, a guy named Brown. And they were all on the faculty at that time, and they were not my idea of what an art teacher would be. I spent a year there, and then I transferred to the University of Oregon because one of my teachers, besides Pedro Miller, he had two people teaching actually specific art classes. He was really a ceramics master, and he and his wife, Laura Andresen, was the head of the department at UCLA while he was the head of the department at Long Beach City College because he was so goofy.
Well, we have a few of these. So were these when you were at UCLA?
Yeah, these were on UCLA, but they were very compulsive and very designed, and they had to do with what I considered flat Byzantine perspective, where the line doesn't go this way, it comes toward you. And here was a billboard. I was way ahead of my time, not realizing it was a torn billboard, and I placed that. That was Gladys McBean, this old brick kiln that was on 14th and Olympic, long ago deceased. And these were the big kilns and the stacks. And of course, I redesigned the elements so they would fit into this horizontal, vertical. I was into horizontal. And then pouring as much energy or material into, like later on even more so, like filling a tooth with silver, and they squeeze it in, you can hear that sound. Well, I was trying to press in.
Well, and Ed pulled these out for me the other day when I was over at the studio, and the intensity of the working of the surface is amazing. There's a lot of layers of color, which the pixelation actually, in its own way, kind of replicates. Alan, could you see just a couple more from this series?
Yeah,
that's down at the beach?
This was down in Venice Beach, the handball courts. And I also played a lot of table tennis or paddle tennis. So I put that paddle tennis in there, and I was interested in these crisscross things early before I ever did the painting grids. There was a kind of design element along with the targets and along with the net on the ping pong table, and then pressing in with black graphite over and over and over again so it filled the whole thing in. This vertical line here is something that happened through the computer. And
I think there's one, maybe
cloud
one.
skate. There's another one up there. This one here was the second one I did in this series. This was a place on Veteran Avenue that I lived in, the second apartment back. It was an apartment thing. But I was playing with the horizon line, cutting through the blinds all the way across. The top one, I lined that up with that rail, went out on the balcony in the back apartment, but it has a perspective of come forward. And then I was also interested in celestial activities, where you can see a moon in eclipse, and then another moon in darkness with radiating lines. And then these cypress trees that are lined up, they weren't there. I invented those. So I put some things in to fill out the whole image that I was working with.
I think there's maybe one more from this, a couple more.
This was the first one I did. This was a house up in Holmby Hills that I abstracted and reversed some of the perspective. And there is the moon again in various stages.
It's amazing. It kind of has a Russian constructivist feeling to it. And then this one, again.
I had a place on the beach in '55. This was later on. There was a runner running out following that line, but I removed him. That's obviously one of the lifeguard stands. And this was a bench along the walk on Oceanfront Walk. And there's a shadow, a sort of silhouette, a kind of a ghost type thing. I was interested in ghosts, but I didn't know how to place them in this context. That was a gridded paper. You can see the grids in there. So grid was a kind of early support system, or what would the word be? An armature in which to hang the paint. And I always liked the idea of grids. And then I started playing with the grids as a way of hanging. What am I going to do with the paint? How am I going to make a mark?
And then I think we have some early paintings. Now,
yeah, these were 50s when I was at the Ferris Gallery, my first exhibition.
so you were part of the original stable of artists at Ferris Gallery. And was this the sort of work you were doing then?
Yeah, this was, Walter Hopp started this gallery in 1957. Just before that, he put on a wonderful show at the merry-go-round in Santa Monica, Venice, Ocean Park, I guess it was. And he stretched canvas high all around the animals that were going up and down like that, and wires. And he brought down all these painters from San Francisco, Clifford Still, Rothko, Frank Lobdell, Sonia Gektoff, and Jay DeFeo, among a few. And so he introduced that to Los Angeles, the San Francisco painters. And then as time went on, he got fascinated with some of the local artists. The first one was Wally Berman, who was a poet.
So he showed the San Francisco artists before he started showing some of the LA artists. Now, you and I have talked about this. You and Henry Hopkins and I actually met about 20 years ago to talk about getting down some of this oral history and different versions of things. We talked about that show that Walter did, where he went up to San Francisco and he got, as Ed said, Clifford Still and all these major San Francisco painters, and he put them in a U-Haul trailer.
U-Haul.
And drove them down. And Henry called him and could tell something was wrong when Walter had gotten back to LA. And he said, Walter, what's wrong? And he said, you better come over here. I don't know what to do. So Henry went over to Walter's apartment, and Walter was there standing out in front, and the car was there, but the trailer was gone. He said, someone stole the trailer with all these paintings. And Walter and Henry said, well, what are you going to do? And Walter said, I don't know what to do. There must be $1,000 worth of paintings in that trailer. It's like astronomical. So Walter, being Walter, didn't do anything and went to sleep that night. And the next morning he woke up. The trailer was still gone, but all the paintings had been returned and thrown on the lawn because they were, who wanted those? You know, this guy must have. So now I tell this story to Ed, and Ed said, well, I heard a different version of that story.
Well, another version.
Another version.
Yeah, the version was that Craig Kaufman, who was a fellow student of mine at UCLA at the time, had transferred from USC, and he was a brilliant guy. Frank Gehry was in his class, and said that this guy was the genius. But he decided he didn't want to be an architect, so he transferred to UCLA, and I met him there. Anyway, I was introduced to Walter Hopps through Craig Hoffman, and he brought the trailer down. And he stopped at Walter, had been drafted, but he didn't last long in the Army. And they stopped at this military camp, Roberts, I'm not sure if that was the name of it, on the way down from San Francisco. And then when he got to Malibu, the trailer broke loose. And he was with a guy named Ben Bartosh. And he felt something sort of break, and he swerved, and suddenly this trailer went racing past him. So it went over in the ditch and rolled over, and all the paintings came out. So the paintings had two rolls. And
So who knows? Both are true, or some version of the two, but the painting survived in either story. That's the amazing
they did.
thing.
None of them, not that I know of, I don't remember, were ever damaged in any way, but they were up on the merry-go-round, and that was a very radical show to do. And there it wasn't a big attendance, because the only people that showed for these kinds of events were other artists. The collectors, later Walter discovered that and realized that he had to develop some collector base. So he got an extension class at UCLA, and Ed Jans and Betty Freeman and Don Factor were some of the, Grinstein's, I think, was in that class too, I'm not sure. Anyway, they were all educated to what was going on in New York as well as what was going here. And they became a kind of collector base. Go ahead.
I remember Henry talking about a show where you felt that you would get a great turnout at Ferris, and no one showed up.
Right. I remember when Craig Hoffman had his show. He's a fantastic artist and probably the most brilliant of the whole group. And he was educated, and he went to Europe when he was young, and his family brought him up correctly along. And he knew Walter Hopps. They went to high school together. So anyway, he had the second show. I had the first show. He had the second show. And a guy named Artie Richer, who was always drunk, and a beat poet, and a guy named Bob Alexander, another one. And he had his head shaved, and he had a big mustache. Everybody was very big mustachios. I wish I could have had one. I have this little Twinkie. Anyway, they got in an argument and decided they were going to fight. So Bob Alexander started taking off his clothes. And Craig Hoffman's parents were there. His father was a judge and very conservative. And there, he stripped down to his jock strap. He always had a jock strap on, And Artie Richer looked over and said, "Hey man, I don't want to ball you, I want to fight you." And then it broke up right then. They all laughed and hugged, and the fight was over.
That's amazing.
But those openings were sort of amazing, but nobody came but artists.
I heard that the reason that they found out later on that no one had showed up was that they were up at Walter's apartment, and
Yes.
Someone kicked something under the bed, and they pulled out all of the invitations for the show that had been so meticulously stamped and addressed. And
hand printed and designed by Craig Hoffman, and Wally Berman printed them on it. There they were in a box. Craig flipped out, grabbed Walter by the neck, so I had to pull him off.
For a gallerist like myself, it's nice to know that as legendary as Ferris was, it wasn't perfect in the early days.
Walter never showed up for hanging until 12 or 1 o'clock at night. And he liked to sleep in the daytime. His wife, he disappeared for 4 or 5 days. She couldn't figure out what had happened to him. And he dressed very conservatively and whispered into your ear like he had secrets, like he was an FBI guy. Anyway, she didn't know what happened. And she would hear at night these little rattlings from up in the attic, and she thought it was mice or rats or something like that. So one day she decided to go up there. He wasn't there. He had slipped out down this ladder out of this attic, and he had a little mattress up there and all his books lined up. That's the kind of guy Walter was.
Amazing.
He later became the director of the Pasadena Museum, and when he was fired on too many uppers and downers, and they put him at UCLA for a while, they were cleaning, he was over in Pasadena in this old Oriental museum before the new museum was built. And when they were cleaning up, they rolled up the carpet, this huge carpet, 12 by 18 feet. It's a big office with a big desk down there. And underneath the carpet was all the correspondence that he had all around the edge, because he never let his secretary, never let anybody know anything. And therefore, you never knew, nobody knew anything. And he was always late, and there was a button, Walter Hoffman will be here in 15 minutes.
Ed, who were your early influences as an artist during those days? Were there artists who spoke to you, who you emulated?
Well, I admired, because of the art magazines, de Kooning and Milton Resnick. So when I went to New York after my Ferris Gallery show, I looked up Milton Resnick, and he located me in one of the 10th Street co-op galleries that were a big thing then. This was in 58, the fall of 58. And my first studio there was 10 feet wide, 10 feet high, and 30 feet long.
So you moved there for a while?
Yeah, I moved there. I decided that I was ready for New York. I was doing these big abstract paintings that we saw. Mm-hmm. These are part of that series. Is there any more?
Yeah, there are some more.
Well, let's see a couple more.
And this is in Mocha's permanent collection. Yeah.
This is
That's a graphite
jump
drawing.
in 60 to 63. I went to New York. It was difficult. And
just for perspective, what kind of rent would you pay on a
I was paying
studio?
$45 for that place. And the first job I got was with a guy named Edwin M. Ottoberg. And he was the ex-president of the New York Bar Association, and he had raised Kitty Carlisle. So Kitty Carlisle and Mose Hart used to come over for dinner. And I used to put on the dog like I was somebody, and they just looked at me. But we did get tickets for My Fair Lady. And that was the highlight. And I had to work at nights with him and read the paper and prepare his clothes while we sat and ate. And I remember the first night we had tongue. And I said, "Do you have any ketchup?" Needless to say, he was outraged. And I met most of the artists in New York at that time. Franz Klein used to hang at the Cedar Bar. De Kooning would come in. Pollock had already died out at the Springs. And who was the other one that later did the figurative sort of cartoony paintings? Anyway, he and all of them, and I remember I met Chamberlain there when he first started too. He was at the bar. And Franz Klein took us over to the 5 spot to see played with
John Cage?
who?
John Cage?
Who did you say?
Martin Short? What's his name?
He was a great...
Bobby Short.
No, he was a great musician. He played side saddle, and they made Short No Chaser. They made a movie about him. Thelonious Monk. We went over to see Thelonious Monk, and Klein picked up the tab. It was over at the 5 spot, and that was my introduction to jazz. And he played sort of side saddle, and he had these big sort of fingers, and he would sort of plunk them down. He didn't have that kind of thing that we usually see. But wonderful playing. He had a cane, and he had, and he was very dapper. So I met a girl there one night, and she said, I'm taking a car to Mexico City. Maybe you would like to go with me. I said, I'm ready. I was freezing my butt off. And I moved back. I left this guy, Edwin M. Otterberg, moved back in my studio. But at night, the heat would go off at 6 at night and wouldn't go on until 9 in the morning. In a winter in New York, so I took newspapers and taped them all over the windows, put a layer of canvas, more newspapers, and I laid on my belly. I didn't have a mattress, but I had a platform, holding my genitalia like that and trying to sleep. And finally, at 9 o'clock in the morning, the heat would go on and I'd doze off. But I just shivered all night long. Anyway, I was ready to leave. So she said, we'll meet tomorrow morning if you want to drive this car to Mexico City. So I showed up at 6 or 7, whatever time we were going to leave. And she showed up and said she couldn't make it. Did I want to do it? I said, damn right I do. So I got in this Chevy, 4-door Chevy, I remember. She gave me so much money for motel and gas. And I slept in the car so I'd have some money, because when I left, I had a quarter. 1 quarter.
Amazing. So, and then when you got back to LA.
So then I got to Laredo, Texas. I couldn't get the car across. He probably knew that. And I spent 5 days waiting to get the papers. If I took the car across, I had to bring it back. So there was a way that he said he could get the papers. And I was in communication with him on the telephone. Finally, he said, just leave the car there. Adios. By that time, I had 15 cents. I had a little valise and a tennis racket, of all things. And I got out on the highway to hitchhike. I spent 8 hours on the highway. Finally, this car stopped, a big old Cadillac, and 6 heavy-duty dudes in that car. Hey, man, we'll take you wherever you want to go. I said, I think I'll pass on that one. I said, no, I have to go back into town. Well, we'll take you back into town. I said, no. They got out and kicked my ass. Took all my clothes and threw them out, and slung the tennis racket way out there, kicked me in the head a couple of times, and finally got in their car and raced off. So I got up bruised.
They didn't like tennis?
What's that?
They didn't like tennis, or?
I didn't like tennis, apparently. So
Wow.
I got up, got it together, and after a while, about an hour later, this big old semi-truck pulled up and said, can you drive this? And I said, yeah, I'd never driven a car like that. I'm in a truck. How many speeds forward? You had to double clutch. He said, you know how to double clutch, don't you? Well, he gave me the clue. Double clutch, you do it twice. So I was grinding the gears and finally got it going. He went to sleep up in the back. And so we stopped about a third of the way, and he went in. It was a girl's house with a little restaurant in front. He says, do you want to get something to eat? I said, I have 15 cents. He says, well, too bad. He ordered himself a big meal and went to the back with the girls. And so I took some hot water. I'd seen it early, John Garfield, in a film in Indio, where he comes into this place. You get a cup of hot water, and there were those little oyster crackers. And I crushed them up and poured ketchup in there. So I made myself a tomato soup with the crackers. I was sort of enterprising, don't you think? But I'd seen it. It wasn't that I had invented it. So finally I got back into LA, and a called Irving Blum, and he came down and picked me up, and he was the director, as I mentioned before, of the Ferris Gallery. So I reinstated myself in Los Angeles.
Glad you did.
What's that?
I'm glad you did. What was the impact when Warhol had his first show at the Ferris Gallery ever? And what impact did that have on all
Well,
of you?
it had tremendous impact. Thing is, I went to the opening on La Cienega and walked in the door, and around the room, the perimeter of the room again was a shelf. Goes back to my situation. And on the shelf were paintings about this wide of Camel soup cans. And I thought I'd come into the wrong place. So I turned to leave. It had that kind of a racking. I know the next show I saw of his, where he filled Betty Parson Gallery with Bardol cans of boxes of Bardol. They went to the ceiling and they filled the whole room. So that was a radical thing to do. No one had ever seen it. And then this Warhol show. And it really shook our boots. We didn't like it, we hated it, but yet we knew there was something there.
You know, I think that was the early 60s, and you had, you know, so much of an explosion of, you know, the impact of pop art on fashion, on music, and the colors people were responding to. Did you feel pressure to get on board with that or to resist it? How did you respond to that?
It was intriguing, and I had a certain facility by that time, and I did these sort of abstract versions of Mickey Mouse and Dick Tracy and things like that. But I felt a little opportunistic about it. I sort of liked them, and I knew they were influenced by this. And I later met Leo Castelli on the second trip to New York, and he wanted to see them. And who's the sculptor who makes the big timbers that go up and around? Anybody know? Mark de Souvreau. He said, "Oh, you're not going to do that." And the second loft I had in New York, he made the shower for us. And he said, "You don't want to do pop art. So then I did these things. He saw these later on. He said they remind him of camouflage. So where are we now in this tale?
So, yeah, I think what's always impressed me is that there was that tremendous impact of pop art and so on. But, you know, when I think of the stable of artists that were at Ferris, you all stayed pretty true to a different sensibility that was very much kind of your own thing.
Well, I would say so. Most everyone was abstract. And once in a while, I remember Diebenkorn was invited to the gallery. He'd gone figurative before the Ocean Park series. And 2 or 3 of the gallery players, I won't say who they are, blackballed Diebenkorn because the term was copped out. Anybody that wasn't doing abstract painting had copped out, was doing figurative. And Lynn Folks was also in the gallery, and he was finally pressured out by so much pressure from these guys.
Interesting.
And I thought it was outrageous myself that they wouldn't be included, but my view was always more like this, and theirs was focused toward a career, toward a specificity, that people would know what you did, and it would set up for a career. Mm-hmm. And I was always an explorer, but I wanted success. I'm not saying I didn't want it. Fame and fortune, yes. But I felt somewhere or another uncomfortable with that idea that there had to be something more that would drive one. Once I got on board and discovered there was this kind of primal attraction for me for painting and density and pressure, that it would be there and it would have its own metaphysical, powerful force by putting it in, pressing, reinforcing. I remember I needed a job, and that'll become later about what I did for money. And I went over to the Veterans Hospital, and there was a guy in there that had about 7 pieces of like manila paper stacked on each other, and he'd taken a pencil and like this and over, and he'd gone through the first layer and the second layer and the third layer. Pressure, pushing that this thing is going to unfold somewhere.
Well, I think that's a perfect segue to start talking about your work and your process in more contemporary terms. But before we move in that direction, what drives you to put paint on canvas?
Well, it's a good question because in my 40s, somewhere or another, I asked myself, what are you doing this for, Ed? What's this all about? And I knew there was something, but I didn't know what it was. Not that I know now. But I decided I was an anthropology minor in school. And social anthropology was very interesting, and all the early man and his activities. So I took a trip to Lascaux to see the early cave paintings and find out the kind of origin, why we did the things we do. By seeing our reflection in water, our handprint on the wall, we suddenly, it's like Adam and Eve, we get separated from the phenomenal world. They see this activity, me, that. I'm no longer engaged like a dog or whatever, just responding to things as they come up. And for the rest of our life, once we broke from there, we've been trying to get located back through the various isms, the various religions. And so these guys started making these marks. It was there was a character named Kilroy during World War II, and he made this smooth type character, and it would say Kilroy was here. And I think something about what we do, me as a painter, wants to leave evidence that I exist, but not just that I exist, but it would have some impact in terms of affecting the audience, the tribe, going back to the tribe, where the first shaman were doing these things, boom, 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 and they made marks, and they made graphic symbols, abstract symbols on the wall, and then later on they became pictorial. That was a huge break, that man could make a pictorial thing on these cave walls, taking advantage of the bulging out on the inside of the cave and staining it in a way. And they had these scaffolds, and they had to crawl back into these caves, and there were bears and wild things in there. Can you imagine how scary that must have been? But they needed to do that. They lived outside. They didn't live in the caves. They'd crawl back in there, and they had these little oil lamps that were either bone or a stone. And they would be on these scaffoldings. And in Lascaux, I remember there's really a great layering of many centuries of the first scratchings, then later the staining, later the actual animals running across the walls. And they run down this one wall, and then they disappear into the floor, and they come up the other side, and they turn at the end of this tunnel, and they fall over backwards. What's that all about? Pretty interesting. So all of that became a connection for why I was doing it. And it went from the cave paintings to the shamans to the isms, Confucius, Buddhism, Muslims, all those various Middle Eastern religions, and African primal activities, and then Christianity. So my most favorite painter out of the Christian thing is in What's that, Francesca? Thank you. And it was Cimabue, and he had the effect on Giotto. And Giotto was one of the first painters I became interested in from, believe it or not, Giotto affected me when I was doing those little architectural things we saw here earlier, the flat plane.
There's a real correspondence.
Yeah, and then the layering, he would make layering back of the people, but not in perspective. They were frontal, but the only perspective that they were smaller than the people in the front ground. And one of my favorite paintings is a painting by Giovanni Bellini at the Frick, where St. Francis has his hands out and his eyes are going into ecstasy, almost rolling in to this sublime thing. Is that a factor in why we paint? Are we trying to paint, touch the sublime in its notion? And what is the notion of the sublime?
Well, so that leads me to another question. What is the state of mind that you look for when you begin a painting, or what is your state of mind when you begin a painting?
Well, I hope it's a blank. Paintings for me lead from one series of paintings to another. I work on 8, 10, or 12 paintings at a time. I work outside, and I have a couple of assistants, and we do things together in a sense. They prepare the canvases, they mix the paint, and then I start distributing the paint on the canvas. I wet the canvas down, and when it hits the canvas, it absorbs and makes patterns, and it invites possibilities. Then I start playing with those possibilities on the next canvas and the next canvas. So at the end of the day, say I have 7 canvases marked up, leaving a mark, leaving evidence, but not making a picture, not being an artist, just being a person that does this thing, that has roots that go back. Where did the word art first come? It really bothers me because now it doesn't have any meaning. Artists, everybody's an artist. A bricklayer, if anyone does it, it's a compliment to say he's an artist, that he does it so well, he's an artist. So the term is almost all used up. So I say I'm a painter. And what do? I explore different possibilities. And one leads to another, and every once in a while, I might find this invisible experience of this thing coming out. Like people say, how do you know when a painting's done? I say when it lights up. And unless it does that, you've got to junk it. So when I take them in at the end of the day and line them up in my studio, sometimes put them up, there's one that steps out. I keep that one. And the rest of them, I stretch the canvas or reverse the canvas and start over the next day. And after about a week, I might have 2 or 3 through this selection committee that I'm on.
You told an interesting story about how you got to that notion of working on multiple paintings at the same time.
Oh, right. When I was in Spain, Avilda and I, my wife, went off to Spain to find a more economic situation where she could have help. And I had 2 sons that were 1.5 years and 2 or 2.5 or something, and off we went to Spain. Well, first we went to Amsterdam. That was really horrible. They were sick and earaches and infections, and it was a rough time. And I felt so hopeless. So we moved to Spain because I had a friend in Spain. And they both got food poisoning. It could have been from rancid olive oil. And the doctor came and said, well, you're a young man. You can still have many more. And that was such an interest. At first I went into a rage and I tried to kill the guy. And later I said, Because when I used to work on a painting singularly and it would die, I would die. I felt so lost. Anyone that's done this knows that feeling of total loss. You put all that time, all night, the next night, and then you get a loser. It just gets worse. So I thought, what an interesting idea. Why don't I work on a bunch of paintings at the same time? So if I lose a couple, it's not the end of the world. And the people in Spain had large families, so if they lost a couple of children, they still had 8 more if they had 10. So I transferred that into that, would come into the thing of this cabeza, this body that's little by little breaking down. And my mind is so excited by the invention of discovery through the mutation of these paintings. There's an organic computer up there, one that functions differently, because I can't do, my son here will verify that, I can't do anything with computers and cell phones or anything like that. But if I'm having a problem with the painting, I note it in my mind. I don't say, I wish I could figure out what to do. It's just there. And the next day, or stepping on a banana peel, as they say, it comes to you what to do. Who did this? This organic mass called our brain comes up with solutions and factors to solve problems if you let it. But if you demand it, it just freezes up. It's been my experience.
One of the principles I get from your process of how you work is that you very much are in the moment as much as possible, that you're not looking to fix something or go back, that it's...
Yeah, well, I won't fix the painting, because if you fix a painting, you have nothing but a fixed up painting. Unless you destruct the whole thing, pour a whole bucket of paint right over the top of it, and there's evidence of that other painting. It has that kind of history. And you can do many layers and paint into each one with all kinds of implements. Paint rollers, sticks, oil paint with acrylic paint, asphaltum with acrylic paint where it separates. So we have a chemical manifestation that changes. So I don't have an idea, I find things, sort of like discovering these kinds of things, and then hooking onto it and developing that until I'm fed up with it. But what happens sometimes, similar to an experience I had at the Tate, some of you know me, have heard this story. I walked in and they have the usual gangbang of all the players, bang, bang, bang all over the walls, so you can't really review anything. You get this onslaught of activity. Into the second room, it's a big room, and I feel the presence of moo like that. But there's an opening to the next room and the next room. It's a sort of a series of openings. And at the end, there's a de Kooning painting. And I say, de Kooning, I know de Kooning. I'm in England. I'm going to locate my own self. So I'm heading for that. And this second room I get was very large. Kept, I say, okay, I see you. No, I know you're there. I say, but I'm heading here. It does it again. It does it again. And finally I stop and say, okay. And it's these huge paintings that Rocco did for the Four Seasons restaurant where he couldn't agree to let them have them. And they were magnificent, dark paintings, black and violet and purple and blue, but very dark and very sunk in. And they fit all the walls. It was a kind of experience. And when he did the chapel in Houston, he said he wanted it to be like a chapel. She literally took that and had Zen experiences and sitting and whirling dervishes and all that. She didn't understand that it was chapel-like. The attitude would be an environment where these paintings would have this sublime activity going back to the Byzantine paintings. So when I'm working on something, sometimes I'm pursuing this notion and something happens out here and I say, ooh, yeah, that's sort of neat, isn't it? Some activity. But I'm going this way. So I'm pursuing that. And finally it does it 2 or 3 more times. But I say when I finish, in other words, I've exhausted my interest in this particular series of paintings, I go to that one, or maybe another one that happened at the same time. So the paintings mutate from one thing to another without any ideas, but only discoveries. And then I play with my invention of the computer brain to solve problems I might be having. I get stuck with how they're working, with the particular media that I'm working with.
Ed, I think this is an amazing window into your process. I found a quote by Borges. We were talking about your current group of paintings, which you said were inspired or certainly informed by your interest in Borges, Jorge Luis Borges.
The other side of the mirror, the stone mirror, yes.
Yes, and you're doing these ghost paintings where you're actually painting through from the back side, so you have these ghost images that then become the positive that you're responding to. Right. I thought maybe we could end with a quote from Borges that I found that seems spot on with what you're talking about. You can tell me. The task of art is to transform what is continuously happening to us, to transform all of those things into symbols, into music, into something which can last in a man's memory. This is our duty. If we don't fulfill it, we feel unhappy.
Yeah, I say that's somewhat true.
Well, Ed, thank you so much. I think that's just wonderful.
Thank you.
We have time for a couple of questions, if there are any questions.
Yes.
Here, I'll
Ernie
bring the
Wolf.
microphone to you. Just
How long after you make them are they safe?
Are they what?
Do they attain the status of being safe from retribution or from destruction or from modification, or
Never.
they're never safe?
No, I'll go back on paintings I've done 10 or 15 years and weed out a whole series of them.
Does that mean that they have to die to be weeded out, or do they get
Yes,
transformed?
they have to die. They have to die.
Okay.
There's too much aesthetic and painting pollution. And so I want to not contribute too much. But the thing is, I do so many paintings, and it's really hard. Recently, I went through a process of trying to identify these and setting up a foundation, what would be kept, what would be moved on to my family.
Fantastic. Any other questions?
No? Come on.
Yes, Django.
Well, that's what's the most fun, because I don't know. And when I get there, we'll see. But right now, I've been working on reversals. I always liked the idea. I liked what happened when I would take paintings off the stretcher bar and I would see the backside. And the backside there was something authentic about it, that I didn't do it, that it happened backhandedly, in reverse, which is something that I like, because Borges talks about a stone mirror. What is a stone mirror? Well, he finally says it's not a physical thing, it's a temporal thing. He talks about the labyrinth not being a physical labyrinth, but a temporal labyrinth. So there's this gap somewhere between the surface that you painted and put it on and the back side. And there's a thin little line in there. And that little line is that jump from one condition to another that intrigues me. I don't know what's going to happen, but it's something that I've thought about. I remember meeting, who was a physicist sort of in this wheelchair at Hawkins. And I had this idea for a long time about the black hole. All this gravitational energy is drawn in through this powerful, they don't know what gravity is. The physicists still don't know what gravity is. And it gets so dense that it explodes out. So therefore, the Big Bang Theory, it blew out this whole celestial universal thing. I said, well, what about instead of exploding out, it turns inside out? And I asked him about that. The only thing he put on that little computer, a wormhole. Does anyone know what a wormhole is in space? Where the possibilities, where this condition of the universe is this thing here. But if the density in the black hole pulls all of this universe into this spot, it escapes, he implies, through a wormhole. That's the latest theory in physics. I don't understand the wormhole. I can only picture it. It's like conceiving of infinity. There's no way to conceive of it. I know Chris Burton, he did a wonderful piece several years ago where he painted the interior of a garage all black. And then he'd collected these little space, lead space rockets and stations where people were in them. And he hung them from threads in the inside of this garage. When you walked in the garage, it was pitch black. It took two people on one side and two on the other side. I remember Grinstein was on one side and I was on the other side. Might have been with the Vilda, I don't remember. And he lit a match. It's pitch black. He lit a match. And he has this record of him talking about traveling in this universe into outer space to the Sideral Wall. The Sideral Wall is some kind of definition because we can't fathom infinite space. In 2001, they had a wall too, a big stone there, was sort of an emblem or a representative of endless space, the stone mirror, the labyrinth.
That is the best indication of how your mind works and what continues to drive you. One of the things I love is no matter when I go to the studio, I know I'm going to be surprised because your mind works in such wonderful, interesting, and continually fresh ways. So thank you so much, Ed.